Here are 10 tips for painting tiny paintings. This is one of my most asked questions. How do you paint tiny? And so I've put together these tips for you. Tip number 1, items are smaller than you think. You're probably used to drawing larger, and it takes a little bit of a mind shift to be able to think about getting everything that you see in the 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional world and shrinking it down into a tiny little surface. You have to practice becoming one with the small size and think about scaling things down. And that brings me to tip number 2, which is use a viewfinder. I like to use this view catcher, which I've talked about before. You can make your own, and you can also use your camera. Your camera is an excellent viewfinder. Because tiny paintings are so small to begin with, you can sort of think of them as a thumbnail sketch in themselves. So I personally don't do a lot of preliminary sketching. I just look through my view catcher, and I also take a photo to refer to later because if you're painting outside especially, the light is constantly changing and it's good to have a photo reference of how things were when a scene initially captured your attention. Using some kind of a viewfinder is an excellent way to isolate a scene. You can work out all of the kinks. You can make sure that the composition is pleasing before you start actually drawing or painting it. And it's also going to help you learn where to place items. I don't do this too often, but it is possible to clip your viewfinder next to your canvas. And that way you're just shifting your eyes left to right and left to right. And it helps you train your eye to put things in the places where they ought to be. And if you're really new to drawing or tiny painting, you can use your camera as a tool to help train your mind. So take the photo that you think is pleasing after you've isolated it with a view catcher, and then make it into the exact same proportions as the painting that you're going to draw. And don't rely on that to draw. If you're drawing from life or painting from life, you want to be drawing and painting from life. You don't want to be reliant on a photograph. But a cursory look at the photograph is going to help you learn where to put things. And if you use sort of the tic-tac-toe composition method, it can help you think about your picture frame as 9 different planes. And that will help you mentally learn how to place things where they ought to be. And also, if things look interesting in your viewfinder, they're going to look interesting on your paper or your canvas. Tip number 3, and this one is for watercolor, jot things down first with a pencil that has the thinnest lead that you can find. I used to use a 0.5, and I noticed that if I was really wanting to get intricate details, it wasn't fine enough. So recently I've been using a 0.3, and I find that that's much better for being able to capture really fine details. Tip number 4, and this one also is for watercolor. Use a fine liner for your sharpest details. Now, you want to be careful with this one because a lot of people have a tendency to just outline everything, and you don't really want to do that because then it's just going to look like a coloring book and you've colored it. And that may be a look that you're going for, but if you're aiming more towards realism, use your fine liner to jot down the main areas and then go in with your watercolor or vice versa. And then afterwards, pick out the areas where you have what's called your found edge, meaning the edges where you see details the sharpest. And also pay attention to where you see something called a lost edge, where things are a little bit blurrier. If you're working in oils or acrylics, find a wee tiny little detail brush for putting in those final details, and you can achieve that same effect that way. Be very, very careful not to go overboard outlining things. Tip number 5 is to use brown or gray ink instead of black. If you're working really small, black is going to dominate the composition. So I like to use a brown fine liner. I love to use a 0.05 or a 0.05. I'm finding that the brand that I loved for a long time seems to have changed the formula, and it's more of a lighter brown, and I prefer more of a sepia or a darker brown. I'm still experimenting to find the perfect thin brown pen, but lately I've been using the Unipin 0.1 fine liner. There are also some really lovely gray fine liners on the market. If you use brown or gray, your work will again look more realistic and less stylized. Just remember that black is always going to dominate in any painting, and if you're working small, it's especially going to dominate. And also, you're going to go in later with your watercolor, and that's where you're going to get your darkest colors, and they're going to be more vibrant that way. Don't rely on black to be your darkest color, like ever. Black and I are never ever getting back together for a tiny painting. And tip number 6 is bigger is better. So you want to use bigger brushes. That probably feels counterintuitive. I see a lot of people working tiny and they use a tiny brush for every detail. Use a bigger brush for most of the details and then go in later with a fine brush for the finest details. And that works for both watercolor and oils. When I'm painting outside, I like to use an aqua brush, and my favorite are the Pentel Aquash brushes. And I do most of my paintings with a large brush. These are made really nicely because they have a very fine tip. So I'm able to get large areas of washes down and also finer details with the point. And if I want a really fine point, I do keep a smaller detail brush that I'll go into for a really particularly detailed brush. But a lot of the times I just use the large brush for the entire painting. If you're using travel brushes and you don't like aquash brushes or you don't want to use that, again, I would go in with a number 6 or a number 4 pointed round brush and do everything with that. And if you get to the very fine detail point, you can find a really fine detailed brush for those finishing touches. For oil painting, I like to do everything with a flat brush. This one is a number 6, and I can do an entire painting with this. A flat brush is your workhorse. I've talked about this in videos before, but you can get large areas of color placed down really easily with one stroke, and you can also move onto the tip for finer lines, and you can use the corner for details. So if I'm doing a tiny painting in oils, I'll use a number 4 and a number 6 flat brush, and then I'll have a little tiny detail brush, maybe a number 2, maybe a 0 or a 01 for the finest details. Number 7, layering is your friend in tiny painting. For watercolor, put your light values down first. Your paper will dry fairly quickly, especially if you're outside. And so lay down your light areas in one area, then go to another area. And by the time you want to come back with the second layer, that first area is probably going to be dry enough to add more colors. Wet and wet doesn't work very easily with tiny paintings. Because the surface area is so small, a wet on wet just tends to blend into one indistinct blob. So I find that tiny painting is much more conducive to the layering technique. That's not to say I won't put washes in, but I'll usually put down one wash, then I'll let it dry, and then I'll add another wash, and maybe 1 or 2 details. But again, you're not going to get that sharpness that you will when you're working larger with the wet on wet technique. For oil painting, it's counterintuitive, it's the opposite. So you want to put down your dark values first and then come in with your lighter values later. Painting alla prima is a completely different experience, and alla prima means all at once. So it's a little bit different than your traditional oil painting technique where you can take days or months or even weeks to complete a painting. If you're painting outside, you're going to be getting all of the details down at once, and it's a different type of a skill set. So if you're new to that, be patient with yourself because your first paintings are probably going to really frustrate you. You're going back to your learner mind, and so just be kind and take your time and have fun with the experience. And for both media, you're going to put your details in last. Tip number 8 is leave white space on your paper or your surface. It's very, very easy to get too dark too quickly. And in watercolors, once you lose that whiteness, you really can't get it back. You can go in with white pens or gouache, but you're going to lose that freshness that you get with watercolor. So I will use a masking fluid pen. I like to use this Molotow masking fluid pen. I use the smallest one they make, which is a 2mm. And most of these have worked really well for me. Occasionally, I've had a dud marker that didn't really function the way they're supposed to. So if you buy these and it doesn't work, send it back and make sure that you're using a reputable source so that you're not getting an old one or one that maybe didn't pass quality control. This is the only masking fluid marker I've ever used. If you have another one that you recommend, put it in the comments because I'll definitely try it. But I really quite like the Molotow. Be very gentle when you're removing it from the paper because you don't want it to tear your paper. I've had that happen, and that's its own kind of disaster. So I'll use my masking fluid marker to mask out the areas that I definitely want to stay white. And then I usually don't leave them pure white. At the very end, when I remove them, I'll take some kind of very, very pale wash that almost looks white, but isn't. And I'll layer that over those areas to give it a more naturalistic look, because pure white really isn't something that you often see in nature. I do have a video that I made that I'll link up here somewhere that shows a comparison of different types of white markers that you can use. In general, my favorite is a Pentel Milky Brush for a really, really light, almost gouache-like color. And I can actually layer on top of that and get bright, bright colors. And the other ones, the Signo Uni Pen or the Posca Pen or the White Jelly Roll Pen, those tend to dry a little bit grayer. And if you layer on top, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And again, you might be going for that look, so that might be okay for you, but experiment with different materials to find what works best for you. Tip number 9 is have a range of values. And this is not just for tiny painting, this is for all painting. I think the two most important elements of art are value and space or composition. And we've already talked a little bit about using a viewfinder for your composition, but you also want to have a realistic range of values. And again, you can use your camera for that. So if you take a picture of your painting and then change it to black and white, you're going to be able to see if you've used a decent range of values or not. You want to be thinking light, medium, dark. Even if you only have those 3 values and you don't have all the nuanced values, you're going to be closer to having a composition that's going to look visually pleasing. So think about your painting in terms of that. Where are my lightest lights? Where are my darkest darks? And where's a medium somewhere in between? I find with a lot of beginning students, they tend to go more for just that mid-range, and then for the dark, maybe just outlining things. And that's not going to give you a very realistic look in any painting, and especially with tiny painting. So think about your dark values. Think about the balance of your dark versus your light, and try to make it visually pleasing. And along with that is the fact that you want to incorporate different textures into your work. And you can do that with your brush, or you can do it with your fine liner. But if you look at an area maybe of some shrubbery and you look at the overall pattern and try to put down a replication of that pattern, don't try to outline every leaf. Instead, look for the pattern of it. Study the masters. If you look at Rembrandt's line drawings, you can Google Rembrandt landscape drawings to see how he used different textures and different patterns to really create a visual interest and also build up a variety of different values. So think about your paintings in terms of creating different textures that have different values. And that's going to make your work look more realistic and also more interesting. You're also going to use more color than you think. Just because you're working small doesn't mean you can get away with putting down just one solid color. If you're going for that more folk arty look or a design look or an illustrative look, you can get away with that more often. But if you're looking to be a bit more realistic, you want to think about where you see the little nuances of colors and put those in, even if it's just one tiny brush stroke in one area. Look for those variations in color and value, isolate them in your scene, and put them down in your painting. And that brings me to tip number 10, which is surface matters. This is especially true for watercolor painting. If you're doing a super teeny tiny painting, use cotton paper. I've been learning this lesson the hard way with my more recent sketchbook. The first tiny sketchbook that I had was made by Inkberry, and you can buy those at the Go Draw site. They have an international shop linked on their Instagram page. I don't know the exact composite, but I believe it's a 50-50 blend, so it's 50% cotton. And gosh, it makes such a difference. Plus, their book boards, if you're working on a sketchbook, their book boards are really nice. It's a quality experience. And your paintings are going to retain a crispness, and they're going to take more of whatever you throw at them. So you can do more layering, you can add more fine details, you can put things on top of one another, and you can really work the paper so that you can get a really detailed and realistic finish. The sketchbook that I've been using recently is one that has a wood pulp paper, and I'm really struggling with it. Much the same way when I used my Moleskine watercolor sketchbook. This one also has a wood pulp paper or cellulose paper, and it just doesn't take the medium. And so consequently, I not only don't like these paintings as much, but I don't think they're gonna last as well. The covers of the bookboard are bowing into one another, and the paper probably won't last as long because it's probably not archival. And for my tiny paintings, I want them to be a little heirloom. They're super tiny. Here's your heirloom. Keep it safe. And so it's worthwhile to use quality paper because it's going to last longer and you're going to be able to get better details. If you're working with oils, try to avoid canvas boards that have a lot of texture to them because the texture is going to be larger and it makes your paintings look a little less realistic, in my opinion. So if you do use a canvas board, gesso it several times, sand it down, try to get rid of that waffle-like finish and make your finish look a little bit flatter. So in other words, use smoother panels. And if you're interested in seeing more, I do have some full-length narrated tiny paintings where I talk through my process as I'm doing them, and those are over on my Patreon. And I'll also have them on my website where you can just purchase a bundle if Patreon isn't your thing. And those will be up very soon. Thank you so much again for watching. I really appreciate your support. I hope you have a beautiful day and happy painting.